I'm so excited because today we have a very, very special event in store with you with our speaker, Mei Ke. Now, LGBT plus UX, this event is designed to spark a conversation about inclusion of LGBTQ plus identities in the design of UX. This presentation will discuss the basics of gender and queer identity, and we'll break down how diversity can be recognized and represented in UX systems. We will have an open Q&A after May's presentation, so make sure that you write down any questions as they come up in the chat so they can have a chance to answer them during the presentation. But fear not, if they're not able to get to you during like the actual presentation, we will have a spot afterwards for Q&A specifically. And another thing too is for accessibility reasons, May has been fantastic and actually linked their presentation for you all in the chat. So if you need help finding that, our team can totally help you all. But without further ado, May, welcome, and I'll just hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen. I'm excited to be here. Just kind of a little bit of an introduction. I do want to say this because some of our people in part of this event may not be as familiar with LGBT terms. So I will be using the term queer in this presentation to represent the LGBTQ plus community. But I would also caution, especially if you are from an international community or if you are not familiar with the LGBT community, please do not use this word unless you are part of the community, as some people consider it a slur. And I also just want to, preface this whole presentation also by saying I might say the word trans, and that's meant to mean the word transgender. It's just a shortening of the term. And as Julia just said, thank you for the wonderful introduction. Please send all of your messages in the chat. I will be reading some of them as I'm going through, but of course we'll have a Q&A at the end that you're welcome to ask questions in. So without further ado, here we go. So a little bit about me, as Julia just said, my name is Mei. Nice to meet all of you. I use they, them pronouns. My last name is Ke. And I am non-binary and queer. I have a master's degree from International Affairs at UC San Diego, and I specialize in cultural interpretation and translation. And Julia and Vicky actually reached out to me for some of the work that I've done in diversity and inclusion in my own field, and now I'm bringing that to you here in UX design, and I'm very excited. So kind of the question when we come in here is, why are we here, right? Why me specifically? What are we actually talking about? And what I really want to bring up here is, as a political scientist, I have to bring in politics a little bit here. It's interesting because I think people think that LGBT people have had rights for forever because we're so used to it now. We don't really think about it in the same way we used to. But the reality is, gay people, and especially in America, have only been able to marry since 2015, and queer people like myself and trans people only gained the protections for against workplace discrimination in June of this year. So very, very recently, until June, I did not have protections for my own human rights in the workplace. And still even today, queer and trans people are still under threat, both legally and also just in our basic lives. And until we see true recognition and integration of queer and trans people into society, it's important to be educated and pay respect to the queer and trans people around us and make sure that they feel safe in our spaces, whether that's in friendships or in the workplace or, as fellow students. So I want to, again, a lot of this is a little caveat and a please note here, but gender and sexuality are really complicated. I also want to make a note here that terminology may change as we find better descriptions for what people just experience in their own lives. Terminology is also really different around the world. I saw that we have a lot of different people from different countries around the world, and I'm just speaking from an American experience. I'm originally from Texas, so that also, comes into my own experience of my queerness and of my non-binariness. And so you need to be aware of that. There might be different terms around the world, but I always say be willing to make mistakes and take corrections gracefully, and just be respectfully curious about the things that you aren't educated on. And that's really what all people want. They just want you to be curious and respectful. That's all I could ever ask of someone. So let's introduce gender a little bit, because I think this is one of the most complicated topics that I'm going to be talking about, especially because there's a lot of misconceptions about what gender is. I think the first one that comes to mind is that gender equals sex. They're completely separate categories. So gender does not actually equal the sex or the sexuality of a person. They're completely independent. So basically what you're saying is gender is a descriptor of the way we experience the world. And, you know, I could say like, okay, I experience the world in the American context, in the California context. I'm currently in San Diego. But I also experience gender as, you know, someone who was assigned female at birth and is now non-binary. So I experience gender in different ways. Sex is something that is we can medically define and has a definition that's a lot easier to define than gender, which is really socially constructed. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about a little bit. So I'm going to show you the very basic, very, very basic sex and gender spectrum. So whenever we think of sex and gender, we think, okay, there's male and female, there's man and woman. But as you can see, I put a spectrum on there and you might have a little bit of questions about that. So let's talk about kind of why it's a spectrum and why it's more complicated, even in sex, than we might originally think. So the first reason is actually a lot of people don't realize that there isn't just two options for sex. There's something called intersex, which is where you might have a combination of either genitals or of hormones or of, you know, you might have different genetics that mean that you are not neither male nor female. You're somewhere in between. And there's lots, you know, as I said, there's a variation there. So you see the purple is a whole spectrum of different identities. And unfortunately, intersex people don't have a lot of protections under the law currently. And a lot of intersex people, unfortunately, get corrective surgery without their consent through doctors who may say, like, hey, you have to be one or the other, and we don't accept intersex people at our clinic or our practice. And so that's actually a huge problem that the queer community in general have been kind of trying to understand. And it also informs our understanding of gender because, you know, inherently, if we have an intersex identity that we can medically define, that we know is real, then how can we say that man and woman are the only option, right? There has to be something in between. And I personally identify as assigned female at birth, but I identify as non-binary. Another word you might hear some people say is genderqueer. And that's basically saying, okay, well, if there's an intersex identity, there's something in between, you know, male and female, man and woman, then there has to be something in between in that gender area. And that's kind of, it can be either not either of these identities. It could be both. It can be somewhere in between. For me personally, I identify as somewhere in between or something of a combination of both of them. And so that's kind of why we're bringing this idea of a spectrum in there. We're saying, okay, well, there's something in between. Let's put a name on that. And we're going to call it non-binary for our purposes right now, or genderqueer is another term that you might hear. So there's also a third piece of the puzzle, right? So I think it's interesting because people think, okay, well, now we have these two identities, right? So that's the only option. There's only two identities. And, you know, we can do sex and gender and that's it. But it's more complicated than that, right? So we have gender expression, which is the way that we outwardly show ourselves to other people. And gender expression can be maybe, you know, today I'm wearing a dress shirt versus maybe I was wearing a blouse yesterday, or if I'm wearing a, you know, pants versus a skirt. And again, this is all very contextual based on where you live and where you're coming from, right? So, you know, if you were living in Scotland, maybe wearing a kilt is going to be different than wearing a skirt. So it's all very contextual based on your own personal culture and how you're experiencing gender yourself. But this third kind of option, again, is we're going to name it as, you know, not either, both are in between, and we're going to technically term it as androgynous. So it's something that's in between. So, you know, we might say, okay, well, in this case, non-binary people should always be androgynous. But that's not actually going to be the case, as we're going to examine in a second. But we do want to have that option of, you know, maybe someone is female and they're also more feminine. They're, you know, they identify as a woman, but they want to be more androgynous in their presentation. But, you know, again, we need to respect their original identity, and that's what's really important here. So this is more about how we present ourselves to the outside world and not necessarily defining what our actual gender or sex identity is. So like I just said, this is kind of the gender trifecta if we're going to have like explaining gender in a way, in a simple graph, right? Rather than making it more complicated than it needs to be. And so in this gender trifecta, we have, you know, of course, the component of sex, how you're, you know, genetically identified at birth, gender, which is going to be your personal identity and how you contextualize yourself in the society you live in, and gender expression, which is how you're going to express yourself in the society you live in, which again, of course, it all comes down to that little, you know, asterisk of this is very contextual based on where you are and based on who you talk to. So, you know, again, keep that in mind. So let's look at some examples here. So as you can see on the left example, it would be a transgender woman. So if we're using our three little spectrums here, we would say, okay, well, this person was assigned male at birth, but their gender identity is that of a woman. And in this case, their gender expression is very feminine. So that would be something that, even though they're not considered, you know, quote unquote normal or average, they're also presenting in a way, their gender expression is presenting in a way that reflects their gender identity. But in an opposite example, we have a masculine presenting woman. So like I was just saying earlier, what if someone was born female, you know, they identify as a woman, but maybe they dress really butch, maybe they dress in a very masculine manner. That doesn't necessarily negate their gender identity, right? Because that's their personal understanding of how they relate to the world, but they want to express themselves in a certain way. Just like, you know, if I said, oh, I really like wearing the color blue, that's not going to negate that other colors are also pretty. It's just a way that they like to express themselves. So kind of going further into this, as you can see, gender is so complicated. I'm just covering the very, very basics here. I'm not giving you the full rundown of every single identity. I'm not even putting all the identities that I know of in this little chart, but this is a very simplified version of how I would explain gender to someone else. And, you know, you can see those caveats again, it comes up again and again. You know, these identities are not all inclusive, but also remember that these identities have existed far beyond the internet. And I think I get a lot of people who tell me, well, you're non-binary because you've used the internet. And in fact, I'm non-binary because I'm non-binary and not because, you know, I was using Tumblr or whatever at age 12. There's a lot of identities, especially in indigenous cultures, that exist beyond the binary that unfortunately, when we're saying, oh, there's only man and woman, what we're doing is we're colonizing that term and saying, you know, as white people, we've decided that there's only man and woman, when in fact, a lot of cultures have had identities beyond the binary for generations before white people even came to their culture. And so it's really important whenever we talk about gender identity to say, this isn't just a fad. This is something that's been happening and something that's been discussed all around the world in lots of different cultures. And just because my, you know, and I always tell people my identity is non-binary, but that contextually might change if I'm in a different environment. So if I'm in an environment where femininity is seen in a different light than it is currently in the United States, that might change my contextual understanding of, you know, what pronouns I'm comfortable with, what kind of identity I'm comfortable with someone else calling me. And it's really about how you feel in relation to other people. So I just want to continue this and talking about sexuality. So hopefully some of you will be a little bit more familiar with this, but I kind of want to break down some barriers as well. The whole point of this is to kind of challenge you in your perceptions of what gender and sexuality is. So the first one that's a little controversial I found is sexuality does not equal attraction to genitals. I think I have a lot of people who think that this is the case, that like, oh, well, you know, if I'm a woman and I like a penis, then I'm obviously straight, and that's how it is. But it's more complicated than that, right? So sexuality is really an attraction to a person for their feminine, masculine, or androgynous traits that they have. And defining sexuality based on genitals is, number one, transphobic, and that's a huge problem because for people like me, you know, there's a lot of assumptions about what genitals I have, and I'm like, it's not really your business unless you're specifically, you know, my doctor who's going to be dealing with that, or my sexual partner, who again, you know, that's a little bit more contextual. But I also think it's important to note that I find it interesting that people argue this point when you don't automatically know the genitals of the person you think is attractive, right? So if you see someone on the street and say like, oh, that person's really attractive, is the first thought you have like, oh, I really like that person's genitals, even though I can't necessarily see them. No, it's all about how they're presenting themselves to the world, right? So the reason why we're talking about this is because, again, it comes back to the spectrum. You'll hear me say this over and over again. It's this idea of masculinity, androgyny, and femininity. So I consider myself a little bit closer on the masculine spectrum. And so I'd say, you know, you could say like, okay, well, I present myself as a more masculine person. So people who like masculine people might be more interested in me. Versus, you know, people who like more feminine people may not be as interested in me because of, you know, the way I present myself to the world and the way I understand my gender identity. But I also want to make a note here, as you can see at the bottom, there's also an option here of having no sexual attraction. And there are actually a surprising amount of people don't feel any sexual attraction at all, and they might identify as asexual or demisexual. Demisexual is where you feel some sexual attraction, but only to people that you have a really close bond with. And I think a lot of people can relate to that more than they might originally realize. And you might, of course, see some of these labels you might be familiar with, this idea of straight, of lesbian, of gay, bisexual. You know, as I've been mentioning throughout this presentation, the idea of queer has also become more popular within the LGBT community because it's a lot faster to say. And it's also reclaiming of a term that was originally used as a slur. And so a lot of people have really felt like this is a good way to kind of understand, hey, I'm interested in more than one option. And I also want to kind of keep my options open to see whoever is interested in me as well. And I think, you know, we're just touching the surface here, right? So we're talking about sexual attraction, but I also want to bring in a second part of this because you might say, okay, well, I'm asexual, but I'm still attracted to people. So how does that make sense? And that second part comes in here about the romantic attraction spectrum. So you might say, okay, well, I'm not sexually attracted to people, but I am interested in a romantic relationship with someone. And sometimes you might say, well, okay, I'm only interested in romantic relationships with someone who's feminine. So you could define that as straight, you can define that as gay, you can define that as sapphic, which is originally based on the Greek person Sappho's, who was considered the original lesbian. If you have any questions about that, I would definitely Google her. She's very interesting. But, you know, again, you might have a situation where you feel like, oh, well, I'm gay and I'm a man who likes men, you know, in my sexual attraction spectrum, but I may not be romantically interested in someone. I'm just interested in a person for their physicality. You might be considered aromantic, so you don't necessarily like someone, or demi-romantic, so you have to have a really close connection with someone before you consider having a romantic relationship with them. So again, this is really, really complicated, and I'm oversimplifying to a huge degree, but I'm trying to make it something that's understandable and accessible to lots of different people. And, you know, I see in the chat, Jordan, yeah, that's a great point there. I'm not even touching about how people have romantic attraction spectrums with their own friends. And it's not just like saying, oh, I have lots of friends who I'm in romantic relationship with. It's also about saying like, I can have really intense and fulfilling relationships with my friends that are just on the same level of romantic attraction, but it's going to be a different kind of commitment to them. So as you get into this and as you will do more research in this, hopefully, you'll learn that there's so many different people who understand, especially in the queer community, that relationships are complicated. And they love that complication, saying like, yes, let's talk about how complicated this is and how our relationship is more than just a friendship or more than just romantic or more than just sexual. And how do we understand ourselves in that context, you know, in our personal relationship, but also in the world around us? And how do we kind of challenge those preconceptions that we already have? So like I was just saying, here's kind of the sexuality duo, again, oversimplified to a huge degree. But as you can see the sexual attraction side and the romantic attraction side. And you might be in a situation where both of those things line up. Like you could say, okay, well, for a gay man, so someone who identifies as a man, they say like, oh, I'm sexually attracted to men or masculinity. And I have romantic attraction to masculinity as well. So I would identify as gay. But you can also have situations like I was just mentioning. You say like, okay, I'm asexual, so I'm not sexually attracted to anyone, but I'm also interested in a romantic relationship with someone who's very feminine. So you might be sapphic, you might identify as gay, however you want to identify based on your gender. And I think something to, again, you know, always caveating here is whenever you're talking about sexuality, the person, as you're defining it, I'm defining it based on my gender identity in relation to the other person's gender identity, not in relation to their genitals or anything else. So I think a lot of people will say, okay, you know, what if me as a non-binary person who is assigned female at birth had a relationship with a trans woman who's assigned male at birth? They would say, oh, that's a straight relationship because there's a penis and a vagina involved, which is not appropriate, right? Like we're two trans people having a trans relationship, right? And so that's why you need to define things based off gender identity. It becomes a lot more complicated. But I personally find that that complication is where you get to have those deep discussions and understand like, oh, this is more interesting and more deep and more involved than originally I thought, rather than just kind of this basic slap a label on it and it works. It's much more complicated than that. So, you know, as I just said, again, this is an idea of trying to combine all of this in a graphic that makes sense. And I would say something like this would probably be the easiest way to explain it to someone in a graphic is, okay, you have a masculine umbrella, and depending, you know, if I was a woman and I liked masculinity, I might identify as straight. If I was a man and I like masculinity, I might identify as gay. And I want to also point out, I haven't said this earlier, but you know, when you're under the feminine umbrella, some people will use gay or some people might use lesbian to identify themselves if they're a woman who likes women, or who likes femininity. And those can be interchangeable. But again, this is all about how can you make sure that the other person is comfortable. So I personally use the label queer in non-queer spaces, but in queer spaces, I also use the label gay, because for me growing up, the label gay meant the same thing as queer or bisexual. But that's not, again, this is not something that you can say in a space that does not have the context for it. So it's all about what can I say to make this understandable to everyone and not just to certain groups of people. And, you know, as you can say, again, you can see that there's no sexual attraction at the very bottom. The asexuality, or people who are asexual, are down there. And, you know, this is going back to what we earlier said about gender identity. These kind of sexual identities and sexual orientations have existed long before, you know, the internet. It's not just some weird phase. We might have different words for these. So pansexual is a bit of a newer word to acknowledge the non-binary people in our communities, but it doesn't mean that it hasn't existed before. There's so many countless examples of queer people in history, even in colonial spaces where there was lots of queer people. And we need to acknowledge that this isn't just a phase or people just saying, oh, well, I decided to be bisexual for a day. No, it's a lot more complicated than that. And we need to acknowledge that sexuality is a part of a person and not just something that they're trying on for the day, or, you know, deciding because they want to be cool, or they're just, you know, trying something out. Like that's not what it's about. So let's relate this back to UX design. And, you know, it's interesting, when Vicky originally reached out to me, I said, I don't know anything about UX design. This is not my field at all. But at the same time, I was really interested. I was like, cool, this is going to be awesome for me to explore this. And actually, I ended up finding things like this. And when you find things like that, you say, okay, so my options are male, female, or hardcore. And as a non-binary person, I think the only option for me at this point is to choose hardcore as my gender identity in creating my character. And you would not believe how many examples of this I found. Like, I had a whole slide, you know, prepared of like 50 other examples of weird things, like choose your gender identity, communist or Republican. And, you know, things that are crazy. And you're like, how did you mess up this badly? So the reason I'm bringing this up is because people have this, you know, power to be inclusive of LGBT and especially trans people. And they either choose not to, or they're incredibly ignorant, and they do weird and funny, but also slightly offensive things like this. So I'm going to give you an example. And this is the original reason that I was called to give this talk. Is I actually wrote a piece based on my survey I got from my graduate school. And as I've just graduated, they said, hey, we want to send out a survey to see how your experience was at our cohort. And these were some of the questions that I got. And you can see the highlights in there are the ones that I chose. So you can see kind of how this became a problem, right? So how would you describe yourself? They have a lot of different options, but what do I put? Because I'm non-binary, so I don't identify as genderqueer. And also, it's very strange that they put trans female or trans woman, because trans female is not a term that exists. And trans women, by putting them in a separate category, implies that they're not women. And then also, gender nonconforming is not the same as genderqueer. So you can see how there's like lots of, and then, you know, like, what am I going to choose? And my favorite part of this too was that how I could choose genderqueer on my gender identity, but I could also choose non-binary as my assigned sex of birth, which is impossible because you can't be assigned non-binary legally. So it was a lot of questions of what do I put here? This doesn't make any sense. Like the legality doesn't make any sense. You know, and none of these make any sense to me physically, but also just in general. Like, you're missing options, you're putting options in that are not needed. Like, yeah, exactly, Havana, like exactly what you said. Like, it doesn't make any sense, right? And the same thing as, you know, do you consider yourself to be, the options are bisexual, gay, or lesbian, which are two separate things. You know, they can be interchanged, but, you know, again, they're two separate things. And then heterosexual is straight, okay, not listed above. Like, you know, there's going to be so many other options. Like, what about pansexual? What about asexual? What about queer? And I ran into this recently as well. I had a doctor's appointment, and they're like, hey, you know, for our records, can you tell us your sexuality? And I said, oh, I'm queer. And he said, you know, we have 50 different options, and that's not one of them. and I was like, this is a doctor's appointment. It's vital to know my sexuality for, all sorts of different things. And you can't put my sexuality in there. So you see why this becomes a problem and why it's so incredibly important to be inclusive of LGBT people and especially trans people when talking about these issues, because obviously, I had a whole paper that I wrote about this because it was so badly done that I ended up calling them out and saying like, hey, the whole reason I had issues with your school is because you were very trans exclusive. And I've been fighting stuff like this for 2 years. And that's not necessary because you're very educated people. And it's very easy to find this kind of information online and to come to talks like this and be inclusive, right? So one way that you can do this is you can plan before you start. I think it sounds simple, but it actually is so incredibly helpful. Because I think, especially when we're talking about UX design, the idea of what is the purpose of this survey or project is incredibly important because, in this previous survey, they wanted to know some important questions, which were vital to know. Like, okay, knowing gender identity is important. Maybe knowing my sexuality is important to know like how discrimination worked in my program. But did you need to ask about my sexual identity? Like my, what I was assigned at birth. Is that really necessary? Like, the only reason you would really need to know that is if you were, either again, going to be my sexual partner or my doctor who physically needs to know that for medical problems. It goes back to this idea, what is the purpose of the survey project? What are things do I really need to know? What information is going to be inappropriate to ask? So like, is it inappropriate to ask about someone's, sexual identification at birth? In this case, yeah, like my school does not need to know that. Why would they need to know that? It was very inappropriate to ask me something like that. And also, you can also say to yourself, well, how can I make this survey or project more accessible, right? Can I allow multiple answers? Can participants write in their own answers? Because again, as you saw, like it would have been easy to say, well, let's leave an option for someone to write in their own answers. Could have solved that whole problem. It would have still been a problem, but it would have solved my own personal conundrum of like, how am I going to fit myself in a box for the school and invalidate my entire identity in the process, right? So I could have just written in my own answers and it would have been that simple. Or even just saying like, hey, can I add multiple answers? So it seems so silly, but those small things can make your survey way more inclusive and way more understanding of trans people. So in my email back to these people, I said, okay, this is what you should have done. You should have said, what is your gender? What is your sexuality? It was that simple. Instead of having these 3 questions, there was actually a couple more that were asking other irrelevant questions that were not needed. And I said, you could have just asked me this and say like, hey, leave a blank and then have me write it in, or, have several different options. And you can say like, okay, here's some other options. Let me do the research, make sure I've got all these gender identities that make sense. Let me run this past the LGBT center at my school and make sure that this, is in line with what they believe is the best way to do this. Let me train to make sure that everyone in my staff understands why we're putting these things in. And even though it seems a lot easier and it's so much shorter, people try to put more things on to seem more inclusive. And really the best option would have been, let's make it short and sweet. Let's have multiple options and let's have people write in their own answers. And that's the answer. It seems so silly, but that's really how you can be more inclusive. And I think, I've had some people say, well, we can't do that. What if we need to know something that's, more important? Like, what if we need to know if someone's transgender, or what if we need to know the sex assigned at birth, which, completely valid. Again, coming from like this doctor's appointment, it's very important that my doctor know my sex assigned at birth so we can make sure that I'm getting the right hormones. We can make sure that I'm having the right surgeries, that I'm getting the checkups that I need to have. Completely makes sense. That's a completely valid question, but you should say, what is your sex assigned at birth, rather than, some other weird way to say like, hey, were you assigned non-binary at birth, even though that's not a legal definition. And, that doesn't even make any sense because we're intersex people in here. You can make it easy and say like, hey, what's your sex assigned at birth? Let the young person answer or have multiple options. Solves that problem. Same thing with transgender, instead of saying, okay, well, what's your gender, and saying trans woman, like that's super invalidating for a trans woman because a trans woman is a woman. There's no difference there. Instead saying, hey, are you a woman and do you identify as transgender? That would have been helpful. Like, for me personally, some non-binary people don't identify as transgender. I personally do. And so I would say, yeah, I'm non-binary and also I identify as transgender. That's also just helpful information for the person who's doing the survey to know, right? Same thing, like one of the other questions in this school survey was about my clothing style, my gender expression, which again is completely inappropriate to ask, because why do you need to know? You know, like, why do you need to know what's in my closet? You know, there's no reason behind this when you're asking questions specifically geared to how was your experience at our school. Like, you don't need to know my clothing decisions. And sometimes asking about my clothing decisions can be really invalidating, because my only options were, you know, more female, more male, somewhere in between, versus something like, hey, you know, in a professional setting, I prefer to dress more masculinely because I'm taken more seriously. But in my own personal life, I may dress more femininely because that makes me more comfortable. And so how do you answer that in a way that's not invalidating of you and the way you express yourself? So that's why when you ask these questions, you want to allow people to write in their own answers or have multiple options, because you want to be inclusive and say like, hey, I'm not judging you for whatever you're putting down. I'm saying, hey, I need this information and I want this information to make my survey better, to make my project better, not because I'm judging you for whatever you're going to be putting down on the page, right? So I'm going to move on to questions. I know there's a lot of questions that are coming through, and I'm only reading them slightly as I'm, you know, going through. Julia, I don't know if you have you said you were working up a sheet or had a couple of things that you were going to filter through for me.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, Rohan and I have been taking some notes.
Oh,
yeah.
Perfect.
So the first thing, the first question that did come up earlier in the chat is, does religion have a role as to why people see gender as only female and male?
Ooh, yes, that's a very good question. And I'm going to be a little controversial here. I think I've been pretty controversial this entire talk, but it's actually interesting statistically, and I have resources at the end of this presentation if you're interested in the history of this. But a lot of, yeah, I see a lot of people who are excited about that. Interestingly enough, the idea of only male and female comes from a Christian background and from a Judeo-Christian background. As I was talking about earlier, so a lot of indigenous peoples have, you know, third genders or alternative genders that they were practicing and that were not controversial at all until Christianity, especially, you know, again, I'm coming from the American perspective, Christianity came over and said, no, there's only one gender or another gender. There's no options. And that's, you know, unfortunate, because we know even in Christian texts and in the Bible, there's, you know, how do you define an angel's gender, right? You know, so it's more complicated than that. But because of the way Western society has defined that, we get unfortunate examples like Christianity that tend to, at least in the culture, defined only male and female, whereas we know that's not necessarily true. And the same thing for what we might define as Islam, even though Islam traditionally has more genders, that's not necessarily recognized. So, but in contrast to that, you might talk about Hinduism, which has a multitude of genders that are recognized. My official answer is colonialism is the problem. But I would definitely, you know, I don't take it all from me. This is just from my own personal research. And so do your own research into kind of where that comes from. But I would say probably Christianity has been the biggest detriment to LGBT and especially trans activism because of their preconceived notions of gender.
Right. Absolutely. That's like, we had a
just coming in here being political. Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think, yeah, the second question that I have here is, how can we design better and have non-biased UX research questions when it comes to different genders? And I know that you already had, you know, explained some of this, but kind of like the key, like, things that we should know if ever we were supposed to make a survey, like, what are the key things? Yeah,
I think the number one, even though it might be harder for your data, and I, like, as someone who does a lot of data work on the side, I understand that, but even though it might be harder for your data, if you want to be 100% sure that you're going to be inclusive, leave it as something where you can type in your answer, because that's going to be like 100% the most inclusive. People can put what they want. If you want to make it your data collection even, you know, easier, which is completely understandable, I say for number one, for if you're saying, you know, what is your sex assigned at birth, you would say male, female, intersex, or other. Allow, again, this option of people putting their own. You know, you can also put decline to state, because I think you're required to do that for most surveys, but, you know, having another option is a good way to go. And I usually tell people when I say, like, if you're going to put down a gender identity, something that we didn't discuss is that non-binary and genderqueer are usually used as umbrella terms for other identities. You might also hear gender nonconforming. It's sort of like gender nonconforming is at the top, and then non-binary and genderqueer are kind of below that. So I would say, you could say, okay, man, woman, and, you know, non-binary or genderqueer, like / genderqueer, because they're used interchangeably. And then again, this other option where you can write on your own option if you want to do so. And again, like I just said, like, if you really needed to know the data about, you know, do I have some transgender people in the audience that are not identifying as non-binary, gender, or queer, that would be a separate question that you'd ask. But sometimes just having those three things, 3 options, is more inclusive than having like 50 different identities, because if you have 50 different identities, you're inevitably going to leave one out, right? So just having something that is more of an umbrella term of like, okay, men, women, and then non-binary / gender queer people. That's going to be your easiest option.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. And I know it's interesting because, like, after watching your presentation, which was super informative, I thought I was already, like, you know, doing a pretty good job, but there's so many like small things, like adding that optional, you know, thing that you don't think it's a huge deal, but in fact that's the main, like, that's the point. Like, it shouldn't be a big deal, but and yet our minds have just taught us to not think about that. That's I'm so glad.
Exactly.
And the next question is, do most UX research questions about demographics, are they pretty biased and have limited choices? And how can we change that as UX students? Again, you kind of talked about that, but I think, like, to kind of massage that question a little bit, like, what do you see as, you know, other examples, like you were saying with that survey that you took, or that gaming example? What are other insane examples, or like just out of this world, like bonkers examples of you seeing just horrible, horrible
I've seen
things?
one. I say the 50 things example only because I've literally seen it on a survey before where they had 50 different identities that you chose from, and they still didn't have my option. Like, I saw one that was like, you know, choose human being as your gender identity. And I'm like, okay, like, come on, like, you've got to, like, really, you know, like, of course everyone's a human being, like, but so I've seen crazy ones like that. I think you know, kind of going off your question, I think the most frustrating thing for me, and like I saw in the chat, the performative allyship, I recently applied for basically like a kind of fellowship, and it was specifically to encourage LGBT people and people of color and a diverse audience to apply, and yet they didn't have the non-binary option. And so I, you know, I'm sitting here being like, I'm applying for this fellowship and you're not being inclusive of me. And this fellowship is literally made for people like me. So I've come up against that time and time and time again. And I think that's the most frustrating thing, is just, especially, I think, if you're going to be inclusive, actually be inclusive and ask LGBT people, and especially trans people, how you can be inclusive. Because if you're not going to do that, it's not worth my time, you know. And even though I'm lucky I'm having an interview with this fellowship, I'm a little bit nervous about it, because in one of my you know, places where I could put more information about me, I basically went off on them, and I was like, hey, you're not being inclusive in this fellowship, and that's a problem. And I almost made me stop applying for this fellowship, even though I'm very qualified. And so, you know, I think that's the hardest part, is when people, they assume they know, and so they do it by themselves, and they never ask for someone to look over their work. And I think that's probably the easiest thing you can do, is saying like, hey, do I know someone who's part of the community, or know someone who is, you know someone who's part of the community who can look over my work and make sure this is inclusive. And, you know, as someone who works with a lot of data and has friends who work with a lot of data, all my friends send me their options, and they say, hey, is this inclusive? You know, hey, can you look over this for me? And I'm always happy to do that, because I'm like, yeah, that actually does make a difference in whatever, you know, field that they're going to be doing.
Right. Again,
Yeah, sorry. First of all, to the audience, I apologize. I'm in a Starbucks, which you can hear background noise. But tagging on to that question, with the other kind of insane options on there. We have a question in the chat. Does the other option sometimes feel dehumanizing, or does that make you feel discriminated against or anything like that? Or is that more helpful when you're seeing that on a form?
Yeah. I like the other option where you can add like your own
Or
text, I'm assuming. Yeah,
Jerry, I'm not sure if you like wanted to, if you had a specific
oh yeah, I
thing
see his
that you're
question
wanting
now.
to, but I'm not sure if you were meaning like specifying your own option in there, or if you were just assuming like the crazy bonker answers, like hardcore. Like,
Yeah.
is that considered dehumanizing to you, or is that obviously that's a
Right.
little bit dehumanizing? But like, you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think like, when you come up against this again and again, if we're referring to the hardcore, it eventually just becomes funny because you're like, this is absolutely ridiculous. But it is like 100% dehumanizing of like, wow, I don't even exist to these people. And, like, especially as someone who applies to a lot of, diversity positions and not being able to even say like, hey, this is my identity in a diversity position because I don't exist to you. That's super dehumanizing. But in reference to, the write-in option, I don't find it personally dehumanizing. I find whenever there's an other option, I'm like, oh, thank God, like I can actually put down something that who I am, right? It's kind of like saying, I think it's more humanizing because you're able to put down something that you is more complicated than just a box, right? And we talk about this a lot in the queer and trans community of like, I'm not a box. If you talk to me as a non-binary person and ask me for my identity and like what non-binary means to me, it would be completely different than what someone else says non-binary means to them. I'm sure you can go on YouTube and see like 5 different YouTubers talking about being non-binary, and it would be completely different than what what my own identity is. And like you're saying, Jordan, like some people said they prefer not to say. And this comes back to this idea of a lot of non-binary people don't have the option for safety in jobs and in these kind of situations. So like, for example, I can't marry as a non-binary person. And that's, sometimes you end up going into this prefer not to say option because there's a lot of danger surrounding my identity. But this other option, I think for me is about like, Jordan, what you're saying is like self-filling option is really important because you're able to say like, hey, this is who I am. And it might mess up the data a little bit. You'll have one data point that's a little awkward, but you at least are able to say who you are in the fullness of who you are and not just choosing a box that doesn't really understand your identity.
Right, for sure. And with that, I'm curious to know how you have, or how we as UX designers can encourage these deep discussions in communities or companies that do often just tend to slap on these labels or like these band-aids, I like to say, like, and how can we start? We're curious to know.
Yeah, I think probably the easiest way to start, like, I was just talking about, questioning why you need that information. And, Jordan, I see that you're talking about like, and I totally understand the data thing of like, it makes sense that it's a little bit more complicated, but sometimes it's going to be worth it, right? To not invalidate your people. And like, there's entire companies that are built on diversity, and they specifically say like, our entire platform is built on being inclusive. And they get, and I think, unfortunately, a lot of companies don't realize that the LGBT community is super, vast, and they have a lot of marketing power. So if you ever want to make an argument to your boss of like, hey, we should be inclusive of other people, say like, hey, there's an entire group of people that are not being catered to. And if we cater to them, we could get more business than anyone else. There's this one specific, underwear brand that's specifically called Tomboy, and they specifically cater to assigned female at birth people who are non-binary or transmasculine. And they have an entire like an obsessive market, and they make great money because they're catering to an entire market that's not catered to at all. And so again, it comes down to how can you be inclusive and understand that inclusivity is actually going to help you in the future. So part of that is like having that conversation, right, with your supervisors and saying like, hey, I've noticed we're not inclusive here. Can we be inclusive? And then if they say, no, that's going to be too hard. Yeah, exactly. Their hats are also fresh. It's going to be too hard. It's more complicated. You could say, well, here's some options. We know that we're going to get more business because of it. I can personally tell you that half of the brands that I have in my closet are specifically things that I have been recommended by other queer people. I almost buy exclusively queer things just because they're going to be more inclusive of me and more understanding of me. But also on top of that, when you're having those conversations, say like, hey, what am I valuing more here? Am I valuing my data, or am I valuing being inclusive of the people that I'm serving? And hopefully you can make the argument to yourself and then also to your supervisor that making people feel more included is going to be better for our brand in general. And it's also better for the information that we're trying to get out of people, because it says, hey, there's an untapped market here that we should kind of talk to and see if we can build something up around. Or, hey, there's entire people that we've been ignoring this entire time and that have really, might have dampened our brand. So that's kind of how I would respond to that, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm so glad that we're having these conversations. And this is quite connected to that. It says in online platforms such as social media, etc., is it helpful then or harmful for gender identity / sexuality to be displayed? Could this provide more space for discrimination or allow for more inclusivity?
Good question. So yeah, I've seen this come up a lot. I actually have had interesting conversations with people, especially a lot of people are now putting their pronouns in their bio, which I am like 100% for. I'm like, thank God. But I've had some people being like, oh, well, I'm cisgender, and so I shouldn't have to put my pronouns in my bio. Or I had one professor argue to me that he didn't want to put his pronouns in his bio because he was like, well, I know some alt-right groups will, they're co-opting that to further their agenda, which is not true, but sorry, Driscoll. But I will say, from my personal experience, I think it's a super positive thing. But at the same time, you absolutely do get hate. I've gotten quite a few death threats from just putting my pronouns in my bio. And I find it hilarious because I'm like, I don't care, So unfortunately, we still live in a society where people think that putting your pronouns in your bio or putting your sexuality or your gender identity, out on social media is something that should be, that is wrong, and that's something that we shouldn't encourage. But I absolutely encourage it, because I think part of that is that the more visual we are and the more visible we are, the more people will understand, oh, there's a lot more of us than we originally realized. And it's okay to also, I think part of, unfortunately, a lot of the narrative and the talk around being visible as a queer person is saying like, well, you're taking a stand or you're being so brave. And I'm like, no, I'm not being brave. I'm being myself, and I want you to respect that. And I think that's probably the biggest thing is I would say is I'm not being brave. I'm just asking you to respect me, and you're not respecting me. And that's why it's brave. And so that's kind of where I would come from, of like, I really encourage people to do that. Because the more people realize there was a whole recent survey that 70% of Americans agree that same-sex marriage should, be stable, and we should continue to have same-sex marriage. And like that, in 5 years, imagine, same-sex marriage was approved in 2015. In 5 years, it went from 30% to 70% of people now say same-sex marriage is a good thing. That visibility does change things. Even though I'm getting hate, even though I'll have people say, oh, you should kill yourself or whatever, that doesn't matter, right? Because it's all about what I feel and what I want. And I want other people to experience the joy that is me being non-binary. I'm so much more fun as a non-binary person, I enjoy myself more. I love myself more. And hopefully because I'm able to love myself more, I'm able to pour that love into other people. So that's how I would kind of approach it. all the claps.
I'm just thinking, yes! Okay, and in that question, we have another question that also ties to that. And it says, how can we self-advocate for those of us who are LGBTQ+, or an advocate as an ally, other than, doing what you mentioned, putting your pronouns in your bio, etc. Like, are there other ways or what are examples of other ways that you see are very doable, very accessible to us?
Yeah, definitely. I think the number one, and it seems like such a small thing, but go back to your schools whenever people can go back outside again, and see if there are inclusive restrooms. I think like it seems like such a simple thing, but I had a huge problem in my own school because there was only one inclusive restroom that was gender inclusive and not designated male or female in my whole building. And a lot of people would use it. And I knew I was the only non-binary and trans person on campus, you know, in this building. And it was very frustrating because it's like, okay, I just have to stand outside and hold it while this other person is using my designated restroom. So it seems like such a small thing, but saying like, hey, can we maybe make more inclusive restrooms, or have talk to your LGBT center if you're a student and say like, hey, can I work with you on, you know, mapping out where the inclusive restrooms are? You can also do things like talking to your teachers about, you know, when they introduce themselves at the very beginning of the year, introduce themselves with their pronouns. You know, standing up for trans people. I think like it seems so small, but I, especially in my graduate student experience, I had a lot of people, a lot of professors who would really struggle with using my pronouns. And every single time I had this one friend who would, in our Zoom calls, would, you know, chat to the teacher privately and say, hey, you messed up their pronouns again. Every single time they messed up. And that just made like the world of difference to me, because, you know, and even as a non-binary person, it's hard for me to stand up for myself because I don't want to be a big bother, right? And you feel awkward being like, hey, respect me, because you're having to do it a lot. And so having, you know, being an ally is really about standing up for these other people and calling out when something is wrong. I think everyone can relate to this, you know, calling out racism, calling out someone who's being transphobic, someone who's being homophobic, even though, you know, it's kind of the bystander effect, right? You feel like you're like, oh, someone else will do it. If you're that one person, you literally change that, you know, that queer person's day. You make such a huge difference. So standing up for your friends, and, you know, going proactively and making a difference and talking to your professors, talking to your supervisors and saying, how can we make this more inclusive? Let's do some research. Let's talk to some people. Let's go to an event. You know, stuff like that can absolutely make a difference around you, even though they seem like such small things. They absolutely completely change the landscape.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that I've witnessed a few conversations where people are like, but it's so hard to change like she, they, it doesn't make sense in a sentence. And I'm like,
have you read Shakespeare? Because Shakespeare uses they, them pronouns, but okay, you know.
a bard, no.
Yeah, and I was like, go read Shakespeare.
And then it says, as someone who does not maybe relate to the LGBTQ plus community, how can they not offend someone, I guess, like on a daily basis, and just get educated about this without being overwhelmed? Because
yes, that's a great question. Yeah, and I'll go to my next slide a little bit. So as I put in the chat, so I would definitely recommend all the things that I have on here. These are all resources and citations. The further citations are all going to be academic stuff. So if you're more interested in the academic side, I would start there. If you're more interested in kind of getting the basics down, I'd start at some of the other ones. You'll see Ash Hardell and Jackson Bird. Those are great people to start with. I always say, like, you know, the easiest thing to do is to go on YouTube and go down a YouTube hole, because, you know, we're the youth, right? So like I've been down 1,000 YouTube holes. Find people that you find interesting on the internet. You know, it sounds silly, but half of my education on my own identity came from other people who were talking about their own identities on the internet. So like it seems overwhelming, but I think I had also kind of a secondary point to that is I would say, I am never angry at someone for asking questions. I don't think I've ever really met a trans person or a queer person who's been angry at someone asking questions. That's all I can ask, right? Is you to be curious and interested about me. You know, I always say I really enjoy people asking about me because I get to talk about myself. You know, who doesn't like to do that? So, you know, I enjoy it, you know, but if you do find someone who's not interested in talking about themselves, obviously that's going to be a separate issue. But, you know, being in queer spaces too, it sounds strange. But honestly, you know, if you say, hey, I'm going to go to a gay bar and just kind of hang out in this space for a little bit and see how people react and see what interactions I have. You know, you might be hit on a bit, but that's a fun thing. You know, you get a free drink, and stuff like that. It's just being with the people. That's how you learn, right? I mean, that's how we de-radicalize ourselves with racism as well. It's just kind of being with the people and taking things slow. Don't assume that you're going to understand the entirety of gender identity in one day. You know, I'm not expecting you to do that. I didn't. It's more about taking things slow and saying like, hey, what can I learn today? What, you know, can I watch a TED Talk today that will teach me a little bit about this? Can I watch a session, you know, Ash Hardell personally recorded their top surgery, and that was super informative for me when I got top surgery. So, you know, it's 3 videos, like 20 minutes long each, about a huge part of a trans person's journey. You know, things like that can be so small, but can absolutely change your perspective of like, hey, there's other people out there and I need to educate myself. And this is a great way to do it while also finding more information. You know, be curious, be a student. You know, that's the whole point of this group, right? And yeah, exactly, Jordan. Be okay with your mistakes. I never have a problem with people who are asking offensive questions because they don't know any better. That never offends me. If they're asking, you know, offensive questions because they know better, that's a problem. But, you know, if someone says, hey, you know, are you a boy or a girl? Like, that's the best question I could get. Cause I was like, oh, let's talk about gender, you know,
Right.
like this is an opportunity for us to talk deeper.
It's a door where people
Exactly.
and you're like,
I'm
oh,
like, let's talk. Exactly. Yeah. I'm never angry about someone asking me an offensive question. As long as we can talk about it and they won't feel like, you know, it's the end of the world because they asked her an offensive question. You know, be okay with your mistakes. Like Jordan said, you know, be okay with learning from your mistakes as well, and kind of just be open-minded. I think that's the easiest way that you can be an ally and be inclusive of everyone.
Nice. That's awesome.
I'm going to pop in real quick. I know we're past our scheduled time for the actual meeting. I'm pretty sure I'm just going to stick around for a few more questions if anyone has any. But if anyone needs to leave, you're more than welcome to do so. In the chat, I had sent a feedback form. And students of UXD, since this is our first event, we're always striving to improve in things. If anyone has any questions or comments or would like to rate their experience with this event, we're more than welcome to click on that feedback form, give us your questions, comments, concerns, anything like that. We hope to see you at the next event. Like I said, if you need to, go ahead and leave. But pretty sure May's going to stick around for a few more questions. So,
Thank you, Dominic. I still do have a couple more questions.
Yeah, go for it.
And so it says, would having a short description box explaining why these questions, like going back to the idea of forms, are being asked, to provide some context for the person filling out the form, would this be a good starting step as well, to be more aware? And if you are working for a company or an organization that you see is not an LGBTQ plus inclusive in practice, what's I think we covered this, like the best way to speak to them to change that. So I guess like the first thing is just like, would contextualization in surveys help kind of start this conversation, or make someone that is a part of the community feel more included?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think to a point, because in my own personal experience, one thing that I ran up against, because a lot of my colleagues were from different, you know, nationalities. And so like, especially my Chinese colleagues were very confused because they were like, well, what's gender identity? And it's like, how do I explain this in Mandarin? Like, I don't have the skills. So like in that context, yes, it's absolutely necessary to have, you know, more information on how to do that. I usually recommend people will do like a little, if you can, you know, a little information thing of like, learn more here of like, what does this mean? Because, you know, usually if people are on the computer, I use this all the time. If I don't know something, I'll highlight it and then say, look up definition, and like you can get information from Wikipedia. But at the same time, you know, I think it's helpful to provide people with the resources if they want to learn more. So in surveys that I've done, I've said, if you want to learn more, here is a link to learn more. And, you know, link them to, you know, GLAAD or Human Rights Commission or, you know, the Trevor Project or something like that, where they have definitions like the ones that I put up here. But I would say it's all about knowing your audience, right? I mean, that's the whole point of UX design, is saying like, you know, do I feel like my audience is probably, you know, are they mostly American nationals? Or do they all speak English? Or a majority of them speak English natively? Are they probably going to know what this is? Then it may not be necessary. But if you're dealing with a more wide audience, a greater age range, like if you're dealing with people who are older or may not be as familiar with these terms, it would probably be helpful to have like a learn more kind of button that they can go to, or like have a drop down of like, this is more information about what it is. But I don't recommend putting a whole paragraph and then asking a question, because I think that makes things more confusing using. I like in the previous survey that I had from my graduate school, basically they like gave a whole definition of what gender expression was, and then said, what's your gender expression? And I was like, like, I feel like gender expression is a lot easier to understand than like gender identity.
Right.
Like, do you dress more masculinely? That's, that's not going to be a hard thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Information overload. Exactly, Duncan. Like, sometimes that much information makes it seem scarier than just putting like, hey, what's your gender identity? And if you want to learn more, having that drop down if it's necessary, if that makes sense.
Right. Using UX to our advantage, or UI.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that is really great. And I think that one of our final questions is, do you have any advice for the new coming generation of UX designers or researchers as we're coming into the UX field as newbies, and how we can change the field in our own way?
That's a good question. I think one of the first things I would say, and this is something, I'm saying this as a non-binary person going into the career field as well. So never be afraid to stand up for yourself. I think that's something that I've learned over and over again, is that sometimes the only person who's going to stand up for you is you. And so you need to take a stand and, advocate for yourself. But I'd also say that as a queer person and as a non-binary person, advocating for yourself is one of the most valid and most important things you can do, and advocating for other people. I'm white, but I do a lot of advocacy for my Chinese mainland counterparts because I have a lot of education in that. I have two Chinese sisters as well. And so in that education, I'm able to bring my privilege into the room and saying like, hey, I'm bringing my privilege into the room and I'm taking a stand for, my sisters, and taking a stand for my colleagues, and taking a stand for my friends. So, taking a stand for yourself, but also for other people. And don't be afraid to ask for what you deserve. I think it sounds very basic, but I think especially for people, for women especially, it's really hard to ask for what you deserve, whether that's in, finances, like asking for the pay you deserve, or asking for, the work that you deserve, or whatever. It's all about asking for what you actually deserve and knowing what you deserve. And a lot of that takes introspection and kind of understanding, hey, I'm really talented at what I do. And I always tell people, I never tell people that I'm diverse. I tell people that I'm a skilled candidate and I'm also diverse. That skill comes first. That diversity is not I find personally my non-binariness is like the least interesting part of me. Like I find personally that like my career field or my background or, my history with China, or like the places that I visited, or the games that I play, or the books that I read are way more interesting than my non-binariness. That's just kind of like an extra bonus, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whenever I talk to people that might have a hard time understanding me, I say like, hey, that's not the most important thing to me. The most important thing to me is I'm good at what I do. And also I'm diverse, and that diversity will help your organization.
Right.
And I think kind of putting it like that and saying my diversity is not me, it's just a part of me, is kind of helpful for people to recontextualize that you aren't just, the only woman in the room. You aren't just the only queer person in the room. You aren't just the only Black person or whatever. You're not just the diversity hire. You're talented and also you're diverse.
Right.
So kind of keeping that in mind when you're going for interviews and when you're going for these positions, or in any kind of context you're going for, hold yourself as a skilled person, and then also hold your diversity at the same time. It's okay to have both.
Right. Awesome. I think that this like idea of just like self-respect in order to gain that respect is just, I love that.
Lots of snaps, yeah.
Honestly, I'm just like, like Vicky's going off with like saying all the, like quotes that you've been saying, like, don't be afraid to ask what you deserve. Like, I would rather, it's just so good. Never be afraid to stand up for yourself. Like, all of these nuggets are so important. Yeah, and I think that those are all the questions that my team and I have found in our chat. So we're going to go ahead and say thank you. Mei, thank you so much. This was such, I learned so much from this, and I'm sure everyone else can say so as well. Just thank you so much. We're already looking, people are saying like, there should be a part 2 in this. And I'm like,
I'd love to. Yeah, I'd love to come back.
So everyone, thank you so much for coming. Remember to submit your feedback in that form that Donald was talking about. Make sure to also tag us in your takeaways on LinkedIn, whether that be on LinkedIn or Instagram, because that Starbucks gift card is going to go to somebody. And also make sure to look at studentsofUXD.com for more events that are coming up. We have a whole great list of other events that tackle social issues and UXD. So just like not only making you a better designer, but making you a better human citizen. So thank you so much for everyone who came. And again, thank you so much, Mei, for just a wonderful, wonderful morning.